Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Mauricio Rodriguez Laneri, a professor from the Department of Biological Sciences and Florida International University, and I would like to welcome you to a new series of Confluence seminars, a production sponsored by the Undergraduate Biology Program at Florida International University, QBIC, Quantifying Biology in the Classroom. So I'm very excited that you will be joining to meet and talk with very well-renowned scientists and learn and discover how the life and science met during their journey. So please join us in our 11th interview, Confluence interview. Welcome. Thank you.
So welcome everyone to our next installment of Confluence, where life and science meet. And today we have a distinguished research professor from University of California, Santa Cruz, Dr. Marc Mangel, with us today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
And so I'd like to start our conversation by stating that it's really struck me how all your life, and watching the trajectory of your life, seeing the trajectory of your life, that all your life that you have really pursued things that interested you. So that it was really, you talk about being able to recognize opportunities and then being open to those opportunities. And so I wonder if you could sort of share some of your insights, because I feel like today so many students feel like they have to worry about the money, they have to worry about certain things.
Yeah, and would you rather that I look at you or the students when I answer?
I prefer this. You look at the students.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. Maybe I'll begin with a quotation from Dwight Eisenhower, who said that in warfare he found that plans were useless, but planning is essential. I only read that when I was way into my career. But I think it captures everything. I mean, you want to have a plan, I think, for what you're doing in your life. And when I was an undergraduate, I must have had 20 four-year plans for my undergraduate studies. Then I ended up graduating in 3 years and so forth and so on. And I was going to double major in chemistry and physics. And so it was great to have those plans, but I followed none of them. And so I think when we go through life, what we need to do is recognize what are great opportunities, even if they take us away from what we thought we were doing or what we thought we were going to do. Another way of putting it, and I'll try to tell you things that are not in my article, but complement what are in the article. So when I was finishing my PhD, I had a postdoc offer, and then I interviewed at a non-academic place. And I went to talk with one of the committee members on my thesis committee, and he said, well, how do you compare the two? I said, well, the postdoc pays $12,000 a year, and it's for a maximum of 2 years, and it's a temporary job, and this other place pays $24,000 a year and is a permanent job. And he looked at me kind of befuddled, and he said, so what is causing you problems with making this decision? And I started to say, well, I always expected that I would be a professor, but I only got the word expected out, and he slammed his hand on the table and said, expectations are for old men. So I think we can generalize that expectations are for old people. Right? So it's good to have an idea of where you want to go. And of course, if you want to go to grad school, you're going to have to write a research statement, which is going to explain what you want to do. So you need to be thinking about those things. But you don't have to be hemmed in by those expectations. And when you go to grad school, one thing you might look for as you're trying to choose a grad school is a program that admits students to the program not to somebody's research group. And if it's a program that admits people to somebody's research group, look for programs that allow students to move between groups. Right? Because the 20s are a time of great personal growth. And what you think you might want to do when you go to grad school may change completely after 2 years when you actually have taken courses and heard seminars and say, oh, yeah, this is what really excites me now.
And I love the example that you gave of how he slammed down his fist and he said expectations are for old people. And then how you're saying that to keep yourself open, because so often it's easy to crystallize our thought and feel like, oh, no, we have to. And which leads me to something else that struck me about hearing all of your and hearing your seminars is that you have this sort of joy for your work.
Right.
And I feel like, you had mentioned that early in life that you had what you thought were these disparate interests. You had math, you had biology. You said that you thought you'd be a chemistry physics double major.
Yeah.
And yet at one point you had this realization of how to have a great life.
Yep.
And I thought that's such a beautiful thing because what you did was you looked at your passion.
Yeah. I had, again, something, this is something not in my document, my little autobiography. For a few years when I was at Santa Cruz, I was in the senior administration. So I was in like the provost's office. And one time I was talking with our provost and our chancellor, who was like your president, and I was really listening to them talk because they had set very specific goals for themselves from the outset of their career. I want to be a full professor at 35. And then when they got to 35, they said, well, what do I want? I want to be a dean by the time I'm 42, and so on. And I was listening to them, and I realized that I had never set goals like that, that all I wanted to do was interesting science. And I just sort of followed my nose on the interesting science, which meant all the time I was doing things that I really wasn't certain about. In fact, I would come home and tell my wife, Susan, I got a grant to work on something. And she'd say, but you don't know anything about that. And I'd say, well, I know enough to get the grant, and then I'll figure the rest out as we go along, right? Because it's easy to stay in a very narrow area of comfort, but that's not how you grow.
Right. So do we have any questions?
Just on that last point you were speaking about, so you never felt like a con. I mean, I get this feeling every once in a while, like I'm a con here. I'm not supposed to be. I'm not supposed to be doing this.
Yeah. Do you want to? Oh, do you want me to?
Yeah.
Do you want to sit down, or so I can answer and look at everybody? Okay. So he means con like a con man, not like a convict.
Right.
Okay. But this is actually called the imposter syndrome.
Right.
Right. And do you guys who are double majors in psychology, have you learned about the imposter syndrome yet? Yeah? Okay. Sure. All the time I feel like it. Even now? Even now.
How could that be?
Of course. Well, because think about it. So what was it? Oh, immunology. I was talking with Mauricio today about immunology. The great immunologist Peter Medawar. Do any of you cell biology people know who Peter Medawar was? Okay, so that's a homework assignment for you. Okay. Medawar, Medawar, who was at Oxford for many, many years. He wrote a wonderful book about science and society called Pluto's Republic, because one time he was out trimming his yard, and his neighbor came over and said, oh, I know you're an Oxford Don. I just love Pluto's Republic. She meant Plato's Republic. But he also wrote a book, and then coming back to your question, he also wrote a book called The Art of the Soluble. And he said, what you should do to be as satisfied as possible in life is to find where the limit of your abilities are and work just below that limit. Because if you work above the limit of your abilities, you'll not be able to accomplish anything. If you work just below the limit of your abilities, then your work will always be challenging. But he didn't say this, but the consequence is you'll always be uncertain. And you'll always have this imposter feeling going on. Yeah. So I think that's just part of the business. And there's really no good solution to it, except that you don't do work that challenges you. And that's not very satisfying either.
Hi, how are you? So when I went to MIT, I noticed that a lot of the professors there and the researchers, they had a very strong background in physics, but then a lot of them moved towards ecology or biology after their physics degrees. Do you think that's a general trend now? Why did you do that? What made you make that decision?
Why did I do that?
Yeah.
So there are two questions. Do I think it's a general trend?
Yeah.
And why did I personally do it? I'm really unable to comment on whether it's a general trend. I might say, I might put it somewhat differently. Physics is a great undergraduate degree for doing lots of other things. And I think that's true for probably two main reasons. The first is, as an undergrad, most of the stuff you study in physics is what we would call classical physics, and a lot of it has been known for 300 years, and a lot of it has been known for 100 years. But it's about looking at the world and abstracting what you see in the world to conceptualize it, typically in mathematical equations. We're sitting in an art museum right now, and there was a wonderful book by a guy named John Janavy, who's a biologist in Nebraska, I think, called "I'm Becoming a Biologist." And he was an art major in undergraduate school and an avid bird watcher. To fill out his general education requirements as an undergrad, in his senior year, he took a course called ornithology because it was about bird watching. And he realized, I can get paid for bird watching. But in that book, he says that all scientists should study art because artists have the same problem that scientists do of looking at the world and saying, what aspect of the world do I want to communicate to the person who views my art? And then making it abstract in a way that the emphasis comes out. So physics has that same property, which allows people to not work in physics, but to work in other areas, but have the same ability to look at a question and say, what is the key that's going on here, and then to abstract it. The other great thing about physics is the closely linked empirical and theoretical traditions. Now, I don't know, what year are you?
What year?
Yeah, fourth. Okay, so I don't know how upper division electricity and magnetism is taught here, but 1 billion years ago when I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois, we had the lectures in the morning in electricity and magnetism, and labs in the afternoon. And we would do these complicated calculations in the morning and then go into the lab and measure the stuff that we had calculated in the morning. And I probably don't remember any of my undergraduate physics. I won't say that, but most of it. Right? And certainly I don't remember most of the E&M. But that notion of linking a theoretical calculation with an empirical measurement is something that is imbued in all physics majors. And I think that's another reason that physicists are so good at moving into other areas of science, because they don't see themselves as just doing experiments or just doing theory. They see that connection.
So my question mainly has to do with making decisions and like between. So if you have many opportunities at your door, how do you know what is that right decision? So you have a whole bunch of like different like decisions to make, but like you have a lot of opportunities too. So how do you know what is the right one?
Great question. So I'll begin with a question to the psychologists. Have they taught you the phrase post-decision regret? That's an actual phenomenon studied by psychologists. Mm. If you're not a psychologist, just the words make clear what's going on, right? No matter how carefully you think about a decision, as soon as you make it, you regret it, because you feel you've made the wrong decision. And in large part, that's because you have closed off other paths when you pick this one. If there's just one right decision from the opportunities that are presented to you, then it's really not a problem, right? I mean, that is, if something stands out so well relative to the other things you can do, then that's an easy choice. So the problem is when they're all about the same. And in that case, I would say there isn't a right decision. Right? And so you have to kind of trust your gut instinct to some extent. When my PhD advisor had been at New York University, and he was offered a job at the University of British Columbia, which is where I met him. And he told me one time that he was trying to decide if he's going to stay at NYU or move to UBC. So he looks up in books on giving advice on how do you make decisions. And they say, well, list the cons and the pros of staying in New York, list the pros and the cons of going to Vancouver, and then weigh them and see what happens. So he does that, and he looks at the list of pros and cons for New York, list of pros and cons for Vancouver, and says, tears up the New York list and moves to Vancouver. Right? Some things you can't quantify either. And then I think partly you have to realize that much of what happens in life is luck, too. There's a great movie called The Color of Money. I don't know that any of you would have seen it yet. It's one of the early movies of Tom Cruise, and it's with Paul Newman. And it actually is a follow-up of a movie that was with Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason called The Hustler from the 50s. But the movie begins with Tom Cruise talking off screen, and he says, much of success in life depends on luck, but for some people, luck itself is an art. Mm. Right? So, partly you're going to have opportunities for making a decision because you have looked for opportunities. Right? Because these days, very few of us are going to be called up and offered a job without applying for it. So you kind of make your luck by seeking those things out. And then in the end, if you have multiple choices that are actually very equal, you are going to have some post-decision regret, and then you're going to require a little bit of luck. And I would say in my own career, I always had second thoughts about virtually every decision I made until my most recent one, which was to retire from the University of California as a teaching professor and then come back to do research. So it's kind of like the imposter syndrome. You have to learn to live with this.
And yet it's interesting that what you just said, because also you've mentioned that you've always felt that you have to teach.
Right.
And you make the distinction between just needing to do it and having to do it.
That's right, yeah. I have to teach.
And so as a distinguished research professor, are you still teaching? Or much less? Or
much less. I don't teach formal classes anymore. I would consider this an opportunity to teach. I would consider giving the lectures that I gave this week as the Glaser professor. And actually, when I was at BBC on Wednesday, I think it was, I spent 2 hours doing some teaching in one of Joel Trexler's classes. So there are many different ways of teaching. And in fact, 2 years ago, I had a new student and a new postdoc. So I gave at our NOAA Fisheries Lab a series of lectures on quantitative fishery science. So
still teaching, just in a different way.
Still teaching in a different way.
Yeah.
And, and if teaching, well, there are two things, actually, I guess. If teaching only consisted of going in and giving the lecture, that would be just fine.
Yeah.
But part of having to teach is also being a diligent teacher, which means when I teach undergraduates, I don't travel for the whole quarter, and I make my office hours,
right,
and I make time for the students. And after having done that for more than 33 years, I said, okay, I need a break.
Yeah.
And actually, those lectures that I gave at the NOAA Fisheries Lab 2 years ago, I had 10 weeks of lectures. We were meeting just once a week for 2 hours. But it took me 20 weeks to give the lectures because there were some holidays, and then I was traveling,
right,
and so forth.
Right.
And so it reminded me, I do have to teach still, but I don't have to teach formal classes.
Right. And I think that's another beautiful example of how passions and interests can morph.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. And I'll point out to all of you, or I'll ask you, how long does it take you to know in a class if the professor doesn't want to be there? First day? Takes you a whole lecture? No, I mean, right, yeah. You know instantly, right, when a professor doesn't want to be there. And that's why I say in that article, when you think about what you might do in your life, if you don't feel you have to teach, I tell my students and postdocs to think about other things. And I only realized that I have to teach quite late in my life, too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So along your scientific journey, have you had any obstacles you had to go through and challenge with and overcome? And also, if you had any advice on us young scientists entering the field, entering the real world, and how the scientific field takes you to different places where you didn't necessarily know you would go, and how you split for your family, or any advice on how to cope and how to, in hindsight, how would you deal with these challenges that are part of the scientific journey? Thank you.
Wow. That's about 10 questions.
Yeah.
Those are great questions.
Well, of course, I've had lots of obstacles. I failed my first qualifying examination for my PhD. I just studied completely wrong material. I mentioned in that article that I'm not going to talk about that. So what you're hearing now is not in the article. I failed the qualifying exam, studied all the wrong material, and I got to retake it about 6 months later. And the day before the exam, my advisor said, well, just remember, nobody's out to get you, and 10 years from now, you won't even remember this. And now that I've been in the business for 37 years, I can say he was absolutely right on the first part. I've never been in a qualifying exam where somebody wanted to, let's get the student. And it was absolutely wrong on the second part. I still remember it today. And I went to the room where the exam was going to be before the committee showed up, and there was an undergraduate working there, and I used to wear a pocket watch, and I was playing with it like this, and he said to me, "Are those worry beads?" And they weren't, but they could have been. So yeah, there are all sorts of obstacles, and some of them, you have to work to overcome if you have a particular goal, right? I mean, the qualifying exam is a good example. Others of them, I'd say, are ones that you might use for changing direction. For example, early in my career, I decided I wasn't going to work with people who I didn't enjoy working with. Right? And not working with somebody who is not fun to work with is a kind of obstacle. Right? And they might be very good, but if they're not fun to work with, it's just not worth it. Getting the right work-life balance is always going to be an obstacle for all of us. Even To this day, it is for me. My wife wanted to know why I was coming here, for example. So that, and I don't have any specific rules about this. If you've been listening to any of my talks, what I emphasize is thinking about things as a process. Right? That is, each of us has to discover the process we're going to use, say, to figuring out the work-life balance. I think, for example, if one is either working in the government or in academia, you need to write research grants, and research grants always get funded with only some probability, which means you can have what you think is a terrific idea, and it doesn't get funded. And that's a real obstacle, too. And it could cause you to say, well, I'm not going to continue in science. Same thing with papers. We submit papers, and all the time, papers get rejected or sent back for major revision. And once again, those are obstacles you have to overcome. So, and you have to figure out how you are going to deal with it. And one thing you can do is talk with lots of people and try to learn how they deal with these things. And that will help you too.
So you spoke earlier a little bit about the dialogue that, or you said it was communication that scientists have. It's kind of similar to the way that artists have to communicate. Mm-hmm. And I know that previously we had spoken before we were doing this interview about the dialogue between religion and science. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, is it a fault, or can you explain more about how that dialogue you said was not as strong as you thought it should be? And also, is this a problem with scientists and the public just happens to be religious, or is it really science and religion are having a bad dialogue? Does that work?
Yeah, well, the question makes sense, yeah. There's a couple of aspects to this answer. I think, until the time of Darwin, there was really tight connection between science and religion. In part because science was dominated then by chemistry and physics and natural history, all of which could be viewed as showing God's greatness. And that we had these rules for how the world works. In my opinion, one of the things Darwin did was say that the class structure of British society is not ordained by God, and that the British royalty are not there because God said they should be there. And one consequence of that, Darwin was really a threat to the entire social structure in Britain. And I think that was part of what created the vision that there has to be a clash between science and religion. Let me ask you this. How many of you have read the Pope's encyclical on the environment? Okay, that's another homework assignment for every one of you. Right? And you can just do Google search on Pope Francis environment, and you'll get his encyclical, which is absolutely brilliant. And it's all about science and environmental science, and it's just terrific. So I'd say the way to frame this is that if you assume there has to be a clash between science and religion, then you will find it. In the same way that if you assume somebody you meet is an annoying person, then you can find them annoying pretty easily. But suppose you say there doesn't necessarily have to be a clash between science and religion, that they're answering complementary questions. Then I think the dialogue can be increased enormously. That said, I myself am Jewish and moderately observant. So I think it's very dangerous to read the Bible in English translation without any commentary and think that that is the Word of God in your interpretation. Because in the Jewish tradition, it's never read without commentary. And the actual Torah in Hebrew is written without vowels or punctuation. So when you read the English Bible, you're reading a Greek translation of the Hebrew that was modernized in the 1600s, the King James Version, and then has continued to be modernized. So there's education to be done on both sides.
I have a follow-up question from one of the students. In order to take advantage of the opportunities, correct? This means you have had to take decisions to go to different places, right. Correct? And this is something that we all scientists, scholars, we do, right? So I want you to share your opinion with our students. What defines your mindset in trying to handle what you have to leave behind in order to take these opportunities? Our students here from South Florida locally, they feel this is a challenge to leave the neighborhood, their families, to take these opportunities. They can be placed in remote places they never thought that they could go there. So,
I think that part of the answer to this is at the beginning of your career, you cannot be hemmed in by geographic locations. It comes back to don't being hemmed in by expectations. Right? So if you know, for example, that you want to ultimately come back to South Florida, the thing you might just need is to spend some time away to get other experiences, which will then make you competitive for jobs that allow you to come back. I had a student who completed a master's degree a few years ago, and he had grown up in a town about 30 miles from Santa Cruz. He had gone to university for undergraduate school at UC Davis, which was about 75 miles from the town he grew up in, and then he'd come to Santa Cruz for his master's degree. And when I was helping him find a job, I drew a circle around Santa Cruz of about 200 miles, and I said, Daniel, I will help you find a job anywhere outside of this circle, but I'm not going to help you within the circle. Because sometimes our intellectual and personal growth comes from being pushed a little bit like that. And so we cannot let ourselves, for example, take a job we know is wrong because it keeps us in a particular location. If you read my article too, you'll learn that as I was finishing my master's degree, it was the first nadir of the job market. And so I decided I was going to use my graduate education as an opportunity to travel because I had no idea where I was going to end up. Turns out I've ended up in a pretty good place, but you don't know that when you're going forward. You only know that looking backwards. So I used my graduate education actually to travel to various places. And then the only other thing I would say is there's a flip side, which is if you know you would not enjoy living someplace, I mean, if you're absolutely sure you wouldn't enjoy living someplace, then probably you don't want to apply for jobs there. But if you're uncertain, then I would say apply for jobs there. And if you're uncertain about leaving the comfortable environment that you grew up in, well, first I would say you're lucky. So appreciate that you have a supportive family. And second, I would say try some of these other things and remember that it's not that hard to go across the country even these days. It's not like, my wife and I lived in Israel from 1972 to 74. when a phone call between the U.S. and Israel cost $6 a minute. Right. Now, of course, you sit there on Skype or FaceTime, and it's basically free. Right. So the world is smaller in that regard, and don't let it hem you in.
And one thing, if I may add also, that I think a lot of our students don't realize is that when you leave and get skills outside, you're seen as an expert. So it goes back to you saying that you're more competitive.
Yeah, absolutely.
But very often there's a saying that you're not an expert unless someone's not an expert unless they've traveled 50 miles to come to you, and so it's really a good thing because it's not only your growth, but it allows other people to see you in a different way.
Yeah.
So it's really important also.
So I've had many mentors, and I would say again, in my case, it was a combination of luck and recognizing a person as a mentor. So I'll give you maybe 3 examples. In 1969, I took a course in oceanography, and the professor had us do a term paper. And he thought my term paper was good enough to turn into a publication. And he said to me, well, I'll help you turn this into a publication. It only turned out to be like a 3-page paper, and it's not very cited. But it was that whole process of working with him, and I am still in contact with him to this day. He was dean at Rasmus for many years. Most of you are biology majors, right? So I can talk about Hans Krebs. Yes? Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. So Krebs's first 4 papers are on the efficacy of different kinds of stain for staining cells. And about that, his biographer says those papers were inconsequential for science, but essential for Krebs's development as a scientist. So his mentor, Krebs's mentor on writing those papers, helped him learn how to take something to publication. So that was Bill Hay giving me an opportunity and me taking it. I told you my PhD advisor moved to Vancouver the same year I did. Now, we were moving my wife and I, from Israel to Vancouver. And on the way, we stopped off in Albany, New York to visit friends. And our friend said, oh, well, you're going to go study applied math at UBC, so I'll take you over to Rensselaer Polytechnic, and I'll introduce you to an applied mathematician who we know. So he took me over to meet this guy, Bernie Mankowski. Now, there I am, right? I'm like 23 years old, just on my way to start my PhD, and Mankowski looks at me and says, going to UBC is about the stupidest thing I can imagine. And then he said, but the only way you could correct it is if you work with Don Ludwig, who was moving there. So that's how I got Don Ludwig as my mentor. It was fantastic. My other mentor in grad school was a guy named Colin Clark, and working with him was also fantastic. And basically, I worked with him. I talk about it a little bit in the essay, because I needed to find more money so that I could feed my family. And I convinced him to hire me as a research assistant. And then so I was looking for a job, but it turned out that he was a great mentor. And then when I moved to UC Davis, which is where I had been offered that postdoc that I did not take, I immediately connected with the guy who had offered me the postdoc, even though he was in a different department than the one I moved to. And he was my mentor all through my first decade at UC Davis. So I'd say what you need to do is meet lots of people, because some of them you will say, oh yeah, I can learn a lot from this person. And others you'll say, oh, this person's style doesn't mesh with my style. So you just have to look for them. And I don't think you actually ever want to say to somebody, will you be my mentor? Except if you're looking to do a PhD. But rather you just want to take advantage of talking with people and having coffee with them, asking questions.
So it sounds like you trusted your gut a lot.
Yeah.
That you really went with the feeling that the chemistry that was happening between you and the other person.
That's right. And I will say, in terms of that kind of chemistry, the most important thing that matters when you do a graduate degree is the relationship you have with your major professor. So it comes back to my point of don't work with somebody you're not going to enjoy working with, no matter how good they are. When you start to talk with prospective graduate advisors, ask yourself, am I going to be able to get along with this person? And I actually put something like that on my website with advice to students because, we have psychologists here. Do they teach you guys about the Myers-Briggs personality test in psychology? Yeah. Okay, so in the Myers-Briggs personality test is a scoring in a four-dimensional character space. But one of them is how much you need closure or not. And I score on that, I need closure. I mean, I just can't let things float out there forever. And after I had two students who I barely got through their PhDs because they didn't need closure, and part of doing a PhD is closure, I put on my website, I said, okay, if you want to work with me, you should do your Myers-Briggs personality test. And if you turn out to be a strong P, which is the non-closure, you should know that I'm a strong J, and you should ask yourself, am I going to enjoy working with somebody like that, who is going to be nagging me and nagging me and nagging me? Yeah.
So now that you've kind of been on the other side of the mentorship part, you're now the mentor for others. I just wonder, as a mentor, I mean, what are some good qualities of being a mentor? I know you said it's a personal relationship, but maybe some generalized qualities.
That's a really tough question. And I think it's tough because everybody will do it differently. So I'll give you an example. I have a close colleague, and he and I were talking one day. He's a very successful mentor. And I said, I meet every week individually with all of my students and postdocs. We have a set appointment, and sometimes we have a lot to talk about, sometimes we don't have much to talk about. And he said, I tell my students if I see them too much, that's bad. So I would really hesitate to say, this is how you mentor somebody. Except I would say, you actually have to care about the other person's education. And that is certainly the other person's success. And I think that's certainly an aspect which is transferable to other mentors. But, you've stumped me. We've played Stump the Professor, and you succeeded. Because I just think there's too much individual variation in it to say, here's a set of rules, and if you follow these rules, you'll be a good mentor. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I think actually how you were discussing this Myers-Briggs questionnaire, it would be interesting as you go forward and are looking for a mentor. I don't know if you've ever seen this or done it. Yeah, and so then think about the qualities that you have, right? And does this person resonate in those same ways? Right. Because I think that's really brilliant. And for scientists, where we like to quantify and we like to measure and we like to see things, actually doing one of these affective personality instruments might be very helpful.
Yeah.
Questions? Anybody from the back want to give it a try? Anything you've been dying to ask? You would like to ask? No? So, if we're ready to wrap up, in order to wrap up, is there some kind of, I know we've covered a lot of territory here, but is there anything else that you would like to share with our students? Some kind of end message, or one more thing that you would like to, or two or three things that you would like to share with them?
Well, there is one thing that I thought about today that I have not had an opportunity to mention, which I think I learned early in my career too. So my very first quarter at the University of British Columbia, I took a course, and the classroom was very far from the offices. So I used to walk there with the professor. This Colin Clark, who I mentioned was one of my mentors. And one day we're walking to or from the class, and he says to me, the year that he wrote his book on the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics, John von Neumann published 32 papers. What does that mean? So again, who wants to even chance answering that question? So I said, I don't know, Colin, what does it mean? He said, never compare yourself to anybody else. Work to the best of your abilities, and because that's what you've got, right? There's actually, so there's a story about a rabbi who says that when I die and I meet God, God isn't going to say, why weren't you Moses? God is going to say, why weren't you the best Zeus you could be? Right? So I guess that's how I would leave it. Don't judge yourself relative to anybody else, but judge yourself relative to what you could be.
That is fabulous advice.
And then I guess that's where I would end.
Yes. Thank you very much. Let's thank Dr. Mangel for being with us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.